June 6, 1944, Gold Beach, Normandy, France. As landing craft dropped their ramps onto the blood-soaked sand, among the conventional Sherman tanks rolling off came something different. Something the German Panzerwaffe had never encountered before. The Sherman Firefly, a British modification mounting the devastating 17-pounder anti-tank gun, was about to change the nature of armoured warfare in Western Europe forever. Within days, German tank commanders, who had dominated battlefields from Poland to Russia, would learn a terrifying new reality. Their vaunted Tigers and Panthers, machines that had struck fear into Allied hearts for years, were no longer invincible. The long barrel of the Firefly spelled doom for German armour, and when that gun first opened fire in anger, it shattered not just tanks, but the psychological dominance the Panzerwaffe had enjoyed since 1939. The story of the Firefly begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the desperate days of 1940 and 1941, when British tank crews faced an uncomfortable truth. They were outgunned. The German Afrika Korps in North Africa had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of long-barreled, high-velocity anti-tank guns. British tanks armed with 2-pounder and later 6-pounder guns could handle Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs at reasonable ranges, but intelligence reports arriving in London painted an increasingly grim picture. The Germans were developing heavier tanks with thicker armour. By November 1940, British ordnance experts gathered in London for a critical meeting. The topic was simple but urgent. The 6-pounder gun, not yet even in service, was already predicted to be inadequate. They needed something bigger, something that could defeat armour up to 150mm thick at combat ranges. The specification called for a 76.2mm weapon, firing a 17-pound projectile. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder was born from this specification. Development proceeded rapidly at Woolwich Arsenal. Engineers designed a 55 caliber barrel, meaning it was 55 times the diameter of the bore in length, creating a weapon over 13 feet long. The gun used a semi-automatic breech and was designed to fire at up to 10 rounds per minute with a trained crew. By May 1942, the 17-pounder was formally approved for service, though the proper split trail carriages needed to handle its powerful recoil weren't ready yet. Then came news that changed everything. Tiger tanks had appeared in North Africa. These 56-ton behemoths, armed with a legendary 88mm gun and protected by armour up to 100mm thick on the front, were nearly impervious to British tank guns. In a panic, the British mounted 117-pounder barrels onto 25-pounder field gun carriages, a makeshift solution codenamed Pheasant. These hybrid weapons were rushed to North Africa in early 1943, arriving before full production 17-pounders with their proper carriages. Remarkably, they worked. The improvised guns proved stable and effective, giving British forces their first weapon capable of reliably defeating Tiger armour at range. The performance was stunning. Using standard armour-piercing ballistic-capped ammunition, the 17-pounder could penetrate 174mm of armour at 100 metres and 150mm at 1,000 metres. Even the Tiger's frontal armour, considered nearly invulnerable, could be penetrated from 700 metres. The Panther's turret front could be pierced from over 2,300 metres. This was a revolutionary capability, but there was a problem. The 17-pounder was a towed anti-tank gun. It had to be positioned, dug in, camouflaged. It couldn't manoeuvre with advancing armour. It couldn't pursue retreating enemies. The British needed to mount this gun on a tank. The challenge seemed insurmountable. The 17-pounder's recoil mechanism extended 40 inches backwards when fired. No existing British tank turret was large enough to accommodate this movement. The Cruiser Mark Vase Challenger was being developed specifically to mount the 17-pounder, but it was proving troublesome, and delays were mounting. The Cromwell tank couldn't take it. British tank designers were stuck. Then, in late 1943, at the British Army's Gunnery School at Lulworth in Dorset, Major George Brighty of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers had an unconventional idea. What about the American Sherman tank? The Ministry of Supply's Tank Decision Board rejected the idea almost immediately. The Sherman's turret was too small. It couldn't be done. But Brighty was persistent, and he had an ally. Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge of the Royal Tank Regiment had been blown out of his Grant tank during the Battle of Gazala in North Africa in 1942. He'd survived, but he'd seen firsthand what happened when British tanks faced superior German guns. He understood the urgency. Witheridge used his connections, reaching out to Major General Raymond Briggs and Claude Gibb at the Ministry of Supply. Gibb was convinced. More importantly, he'd been in contact with Colonel William Watson, who had worked on the Australian Sentinel tank project. The Australians had successfully mounted a 17-pounder on their Sentinel tank. If the Australians could do it, so could the British. The project was handed to W.G.K. Kilbourne, a Vickers engineer. Kilbourne approached the problem methodically, solving each obstacle in turn. The recoil system was completely redesigned. Instead of one long recoil cylinder extending backwards, Kilbourne created two shorter cylinders mounted on either side of the gun, taking advantage of the turret's width rather than its depth. The gun breech was rotated 90 degrees, allowing it to be loaded from the left side rather than from above. This was critical, as loading from above in the confined Sherman turret would have been impossible. The radio, normally mounted in the rear of British tank turrets, had to be relocated. Kilbourne designed an armoured bustle, a box welded to the back of the turret with a large axis hole cut through. The gun cradle had to be shortened, making the weapon less stable but allowing it to fit. The hull machine gun and its operator were eliminated entirely to make room for additional ammunition storage. The massive 17-pounder rounds were much larger than standard Sherman ammunition, and space was at a premium. By late 1943, the prototype was ready. When test crews fired it, they discovered something remarkable. Despite all the modifications, despite the shortened recoil system and rotated breech, the Firefly worked. It worked beautifully. The Sherman's wider turret ring and robust construction could handle the stress. The gun could traverse, elevate, and fire rapidly. In January 1944, production began. Sherman tanks, primarily the M5 or A4 variant designated Sherman 5th by the British, were pulled from the production line and sent to Royal Ordnance factories for conversion. Time was desperately short. The invasion of France was scheduled for early June, and every Firefly that could be completed was needed. Workers laboured around the clock, cutting turrets, welding bustles, fitting the long 17-pounder barrels. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, approximately 200 Fireflies had been completed and distributed to British and Canadian armoured units. The allocation was carefully considered. Each tank troop, typically consisting of 4 tanks, would receive 1 Firefly. The other 3 would be standard Shermans with 75mm guns. This ratio balanced anti-tank capability with the flexibility of the 75mm gun, which had superior high-explosive ammunition for engaging infantry and soft targets. The Firefly's high-explosive round was notably weak due to the thick shell walls needed to withstand the high propellant charge. For the crew selected to operate these new tanks, training was brief. There wasn't time for extensive familiarization. They learned the loading procedure, practiced the traverse and elevation, fired a few rounds if they were lucky, and then they were shipped to the marshalling areas in southern England, preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. As the Fireflies rolled ashore on the morning of June 6th, German forces in Normandy were preparing their response. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, equipped with Panther tanks, was moving north toward the invasion beaches. The 21st Panzer Division was already engaging British forces near Caen. Heavy SS Panzer Battalion 101, equipped with Tiger tanks, was positioning for counterattacks. The German tank commanders had reason for confidence. Since 1943, their Tigers and Panthers had dominated the battlefield. Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, even the vaunted T-34, struggled to penetrate Panther and Tiger armour from the front. American Shermans in Italy had proven woefully inadequate, requiring multiple tanks to flank and overwhelm a single German heavy. The German doctrine was simple and effective. Use the superior range and penetration of the 88mm gun on the Tiger and the 75mm Calibre K-42 on the Panther to destroy enemy tanks before they could close to effective range. Even if Allied tanks got closer, the thick frontal armour would shrug off their shells. It had worked in Russia. It had worked in Italy. It would work in France. But the Germans didn't know about the Firefly. Allied security had been excellent. Intelligence about the new weapon hadn't reached German high command. When German tankers looked through their optics at the Allied armoured formations moving through the Bocage countryside, they saw what appeared to be standard Shermans. The silhouette was the same, the size was the same. Yes, some had longer barrels, but from a distance, especially through the narrow periscopes and vision blocks of a buttoned-up tank, The difference wasn't immediately obvious. This confusion was about to prove fatal. June 9th, 1944. 3 days after D-Day, the Hitlerjugend Division was throwing everything into a desperate counterattack to drive the Canadians back to the sea. SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, commanding the division, ordered an assault on the village of Norry-on-Besson. The objective was critical. If the Germans could recapture Norry and the neighbouring village of Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, they could threaten the entire Canadian beachhead. For the attack, Meyer committed 12 Panthers from the 3rd Company of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment. These were the cream of German armour. The Panther SFA was arguably the best German tank of the war, combining a powerful 75mm gun with sloped armour that gave it effective protection equivalent to much thicker plate. The glacis, sloped at 55 degrees, was 80mm thick but nearly impervious to most Allied guns. The gun mantelet was 100mm. At normal combat ranges, Panthers were nearly invulnerable from the front. The German plan was aggressive. The Panthers would advance at high speed toward Norry, using their mobility to close quickly before Allied artillery could respond. They would outrun their infantry support, gambling that the speed and shock of 12 heavy tanks appearing suddenly would shatter the Canadian defence. At 1300 hours, the attack began. The Panthers roared forward, their Maybach engines straining, tracks throwing up clouds of dust. They raced toward Norry, stopping occasionally to fire their main guns at the village, then surging forward again. Within minutes, they had left their supporting infantry behind, pinned down by Canadian artillery fire. But the tank commanders pressed on, confident in their armour and firepower. Defending Norry was a mixed force of Canadian infantry from the Regina Rifle Regiment and tanks from the 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment. The armour consisted of 9 Sherman tanks. 8 were standard M4s with 75mm guns. One, commanded by Lieutenant G.K. Henry with Trooper A. Chapman as gunner, was a Firefly. As the Panthers approached, the Canadian tankers watched from concealed positions. The Germans had made a critical tactical error. In their haste to reach the village, they had swung to the left to avoid anti-tank guns they knew were positioned in Norry. This manoeuvre exposed their flank to the Canadian tanks positioned near Bretteville, about 1,000 metres distant. The Panthers' side armour was only 40mm thick, a vulnerability the German crews rarely had to worry about when facing the poorly armed Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. Against the Firefly, it might as well have been paper. The Canadian tanks deployed in a line and opened fire. Lieutenant Henry's Firefly barked first. The 17-pounder's muzzle blast was enormous, far larger than the 75mm guns of the other Shermans. The gun's report was a distinctive, thunderous crack that could be heard for miles. Inside the turret, the crew was momentarily deafened despite their headsets. The recoil rocked the entire tank, but the shell flew true. At 1,000 metres, the armour-piercing round struck the nearest Panther in the flank. The effect was catastrophic. Adolf Morowitz, commander of the stricken Panther, thought his tank had struck a mine. There was a dull bang, a violent shaking, and the Panther lurched to a stop. Before he could process what had happened, another explosion rocked the tank. The ammunition for the machine gun ignited and flames erupted through the fighting compartment. Through his periscope, Morowitz watched in horror as the Panther next to his exploded, the turret lifting off the hull and tumbling through the air. He desperately tried to open his hatch and escape the inferno. Trooper Chapman, manning the Firefly's gun, was methodical. His loader, Trooper Seaman, slammed rounds into the breach as fast as he could, each 17-pounder shell weighing over 17 pounds. Chapman traversed to the next target, led it slightly to account for movement, and fired. Another Panther erupted in flames. Traverse, lead, fire. A third Panther destroyed. The other Shermans were firing too, their 75mm guns finding vulnerable spots in the Panther's side armour now that the German tanks were in disarray. But it was the Firefly that was doing the real execution. In less than a minute, 5 Panthers were burning wrecks. Chapman had fired 6 rounds, achieving 5 kills. Another Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Boyle, knocked out the 6th Panther before Chapman could engage it. The remaining 6 Panthers, now aware they were in a kill zone, desperately attempted to retreat. The crews were in shock. What had just happened? What kind of gun could penetrate Panther armour so easily? They fled south, leaving behind 7 destroyed Panthers and their dead comrades. The German crews who survived couldn't believe what they had witnessed. Panthers didn't get destroyed that quickly, that easily. SS Sturmbannführer Arnold Jürgensen, commanding the 1st Battalion, reported the disaster to divisional headquarters. His combat report noted that 7 Panthers had been knocked out by anti-tank guns within 5 minutes. The guns couldn't be seen, and their position couldn't be determined. It was inconceivable that they were tank guns. No Allied tank had ever demonstrated such capability. The German intelligence officers receiving these reports were skeptical. 7 Panthers destroyed by unseen anti-tank guns? It seemed impossible. But the testimony from multiple survivors was consistent. The reports were filed, but their significance wasn't immediately understood. At higher levels of German command, the Normandy engagement was noted as a local reverse. Unfortunate, but not strategically significant. The fact that the Allies now possessed a tank capable of destroying Panthers and Tigers at range simply wasn't recognised. Not yet. For the Canadian crews, particularly Lieutenant Henry and Trooper Chapman, the engagement had been a revelation. The Firefly worked exactly as designed. The penetration was extraordinary. The psychological effect on the German crews had been immediate and devastating. When word spread through the Canadian armour units about the Normandy engagement, demand for Fireflies skyrocketed. Every troop wanted one. Every commander wanted more than the 1 per troop allocation they'd been given. But production couldn't keep up with demand, and the allocation remained fixed. 1 Firefly per troop. The other 3 tanks would have to make do with their 75mm guns. This actually proved to be a reasonable balance. The 75mm was far superior for infantry support and for engaging soft targets. The Firefly was a specialised tank killer. Together they formed an effective team, but the Normandy engagement had taught the Allies something else, something concerning. The distinctive long barrel of the Firefly made it easily identifiable, even at distance. If German crews realised that the long-barreled Shermans were the real threat, they would target Fireflies first. British and Canadian tankers quickly developed countermeasures. The most common was camouflage paint. Crews painted white or light green patterns on the forward half of the barrel, creating an optical illusion that made the gun appear shorter. Some crews added foliage and netting to further disguise the length. Other crews were even more creative, though whether these methods were actually used in combat remains disputed. One suggestion was to mount a fake shortened wooden gun barrel on the rear of the turret pointing forward, making the tank appear to have a normal 75mm gun. There's no photographic evidence this was ever done, but the fact that it was considered shows how seriously crews took the threat of being identified and targeted. German intelligence, meanwhile, was slowly piecing together what they faced. Combat reports from multiple units mentioned unusually effective anti-tank guns. Some reports described these guns being mounted on tanks that looked like Shermans, but with longer barrels. By mid-June, German tank crews were receiving informal warnings. There were new Allied tanks out there with very powerful guns. They looked like Shermans but weren't. If you see a Sherman with a long barrel, kill it first. But formal doctrine and training materials took longer to update, and many German crews went into combat without understanding the threat they faced. On June 14th, another Firefly demonstrated its lethal capability. Sergeant Harris of the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards was positioned with 3 standard Shermans near the newly captured village of Longèvre, southwest of Tilly-sur-Seulles. Harris was scanning the approaches to the village through his binoculars when he spotted 2 Panthers advancing from the east, about 800 metres away. Harris ordered his gunner to engage. The first shot from the Firefly struck the lead Panther dead centre, penetrating the frontal armour and detonating the ammunition. The tank exploded spectacularly. The second Panther, seeing its companion destroyed, began backing up, trying to escape. Harris's second shot caught it before it could retreat to cover. 2 shots, 2 kills, from 800 metres through frontal armour. This was unheard of performance against Panthers, but Harris wasn't done. Relocating his Firefly to a concealed flanking position on the other side of Longèvre, he waited. Within an hour, 3 more Panthers approached from the west, unaware of his position. Harris and his gunner, Trooper McKillop, engaged from ambush. 3 rounds, 3 more Panthers destroyed. In one afternoon, a single Firefly had knocked out 5 of the Panzerwaffe's best tanks. The Dragoon Guard's after-action report noted the exceptional performance of the Firefly, stating that its gun was finally giving British armour parity with German heavy tanks. But it also noted the limitations. the Firefly's high explosive ammunition was weak, making it less effective against infantry. The massive muzzle blast kicked up enormous clouds of dust and debris, revealing the tank's position and forcing frequent relocations. The gun's recoil, even with the redesigned system, was severe, and prolonged firing caused maintenance issues. Still, the Firefly was proving its worth beyond any doubt. By late June and early July, German tank crews throughout Normandy were reporting encounters with these new Allied tanks. The descriptions were consistent and troubling. Long-barreled Shermans that could penetrate Panther and Tiger armour from ranges previously thought safe, guns that fired with a distinctive thunderous crack and produced enormous muzzle flashes. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German tank crews had grown accustomed to a tactical reality where they could engage Allied tanks from range with near impunity. Shermans and Cromwells could be destroyed from 2,000 metres or more, often before the Allied crews even knew they were under fire. The Germans could choose their engagement ranges, dictate the terms of battle. The Firefly changed that calculus. Now every Sherman might be a Firefly. That silhouette in the distance might be carrying a gun that could kill from beyond 500 metres. German tankers could no longer assume they had the range advantage. This uncertainty was psychologically devastating. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most decorated aces with 206 aerial victories before transferring to tanks, encountered this new reality on the ground, leading a formation of Focke-Wulf. Wait, that's from the wrong document. Let me stay focused on tanks. The German response to the Firefly threat evolved throughout the summer of 1944. Formal orders were issued to tank and anti-tank gun crews. Identify and eliminate the long-barreled Shermans first. If you see a Sherman with an extended barrel, that's your priority target. Everything else can wait. German gunners were trained to look for the distinctive length, the muzzle brake, any identifying characteristics. But in the chaos of combat, with visibility limited by smoke, dust and terrain, this was easier said than done. Tank combat in the Norman bocage was fought at close ranges, often under 500 metres, where identification was difficult. By the time a German gunner realised he was facing a Firefly, it might be too late. The statistics bear out the Firefly's effectiveness, but they also reveal a surprising fact. Despite being high-priority targets, Fireflies had a statistically lower loss rate than standard Shermans. This seems counterintuitive. If German crews were specifically targeting Fireflies, shouldn't more of them be destroyed? The answer lies in how Fireflies were employed. Commanders quickly learned to use Fireflies in hull-down positions, taking advantage of terrain to expose only the turret, while the hull remained behind cover. The Firefly would provide overwatch while the other 3 Shermans in the troop advanced or manoeuvred. If enemy armour appeared, the Firefly engaged from its protected position. After firing, the Firefly would immediately relocate, using its mobility to avoid counterfire. This shoot-and-scoot tactic, combined with the Firefly's longer engagement range, meant that Fireflies were often able to destroy German tanks before the Germans could return effective fire. The British and Commonwealth units during the Battle of Normandy faced over 70% of all German armour deployed in the theatre. This included the elite Waffen-SS panzer divisions, the best equipped and most experienced units Germany had. Operation Goodwood in July, the British attempt to break out south of Caen, saw massive tank battles where Fireflies proved invaluable. Operation Totalize in August would feature perhaps the most famous Firefly engagement of the war. August 8, 1944. Operation Totalize was designed to capture the high ground around Falaise, helping to seal the trap on German forces being encircled in the Falaise pocket. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, a British armoured regiment, reached the village of Saint-Aignan de Craménil in the early morning hours. While B Squadron remained around the village, A and C Squadrons moved into the woods called Del de la Roque, south of the village. A squadron, under strength, positioned in the southern portion of the woods. 3 Troop, commanded by a lieutenant and including Sergeant Gordon's Firefly, with Trooper Joe Eakins as gunner, took position on the western edge of the woods. From their concealed position they could observe a large open area and Route Nationale 158, the road running from Caen toward Falaise. Unknown to the British tankers, German forces were preparing a counterattack. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, perhaps the most famous tank ace of World War II, was leading elements of heavy SS Panzer Battalion 101 equipped with Tiger tanks. Wittmann had achieved legendary status in Germany. His official kill count stood at 138 enemy tanks and 132 anti-tank guns. On June 13th at Villers-Bocage, he had single-handedly destroyed much of a British armoured column, knocking out numerous tanks and vehicles before his own Tiger was disabled. Hitler himself had attended Wittmann's wedding. German propaganda had made him a household name. He was the epitome of the panzer ace, the invincible tank commander. At approximately 12:40 p.m. on August 8th, Wittmann's Tigers and supporting Panzer IVs began their attack up Route Nationale 158 towards Saint-Aignan-de-Craménil. The Germans were unaware that British tanks were positioned in the woods flanking the road. The troop commander ordered his tanks to hold fire until the Germans were well within effective range. This was difficult. Watching enemy armour approach, knowing that every second increased the chance they'd be spotted, required iron discipline. But the British crews waited. When the lead Tigers were approximately 800 metres away, the troop commander gave the order to engage. Joe Ekins, the 21-year-old gunner in Sergeant Gordon's Firefly, had only fired 5 practice rounds with the 17-pounder before this moment. He'd never fired at a live target, never experienced combat. Now he was facing Tiger tanks, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal, commanded by their most famous ace. Ekins centred his sight on the rearmost Tiger, the one bearing turret number 07. Wittmann's tank. The position was perfect. The Firefly was firing from the flank, where even the Tiger's thick armour was vulnerable. The Germans were advancing in column, unable to manoeuvre effectively. Ekins squeezed the trigger. The 17-pounder roared, the entire tank rocking back from the recoil. The armour-piercing round crossed the 800 metres in less than a second. It struck Tiger 07 in the side, penetrating the armour and detonating the ammunition. The Tiger exploded catastrophically, the turret blown completely off the hull. Michael Wittmann and his entire crew were killed instantly. The most famous tank ace of World War II had been destroyed by a 21-year-old gunner on his first day of combat, firing a gun he'd barely trained with. But there was no time to observe the results. Ekins' loader was already slamming another round into the breach. Ekins traversed to the next Tiger, number 312. Fire. The second Tiger erupted in flames. Traversed to the third, number 314. Fire. 3 Tigers destroyed in rapid succession. The German attack had been shattered in less than a minute. The remaining Tigers and Panzer IVs, now aware they were in an ambush, attempted to manoeuvre and return fire. Other British tanks were engaging now, Fireflies from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment joining the battle. The German counterattack dissolved into chaos. A short time later, the main German assault shifted towards C Squadron. A squadron moved to support, and in the resulting combat, Ekins destroyed a Panzer IV before his Firefly was hit, and the crew forced to bail out. Sergeant Gordon was wounded, and after the battle Ekins was reassigned to another tank as a radio operator. A curious demotion for the regiment's most successful gunner that day. He would remain in this position for the rest of the war. The death of Michael Wittmann sent shockwaves through both the German and Allied forces. For the Germans, it was devastating. If their best, their most experienced, most decorated commander could be destroyed so easily, what hope did average crews have? For the Allies, particularly the British and Canadians, it was validation. The Firefly could defeat anything the Germans could field. The engagement at Saint-Aignan-de-Craménil became the stuff of legend, though controversy about exactly which tank fired the fatal shot would continue for decades. Canadian units also claimed credit. The Poles claimed credit. Even the RAF claimed that a Typhoon fighter bomber had killed Wittmann. But when Wittmann's Tiger was excavated in 1983, forensic examination of the damage pattern was consistent with a flank shot from a tank gun, not an aerial rocket or artillery. The regimental war diary of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry recorded the Tiger turret numbers 312, 007 and 314. Joe Ekins had engaged all 3. Modern historians largely accept that Ekins fired the fatal shot, though some still argue for Canadian involvement. Regardless of which specific tank or crew deserves credit, the larger significance was clear. The Firefly had killed the most famous panzer ace of the war. German tankers, already wary of the long-barreled Shermans, now had concrete evidence of their lethality. Morale among panzer crews began to erode. The invincibility they'd enjoyed since 1943 was gone. They were now the ones being hunted. As summer turned to fall in 1944, Firefly production ramped up. By September, over 500 had been completed. By December, over 800. Each month, more rolled off the production lines, replacing losses and equipping newly arrived units. The allocation ratio remained the same, 1 per troop, but with more troops arriving in theatre, the overall number of Fireflies steadily increased. British and Canadian armoured divisions moving through Belgium and Holland into Germany itself always had their complement of Fireflies, and everywhere they went, German tank crews learned to fear the long-barrelled Shermans. German tactical doctrine evolved to counter the Firefly threat. If engagement was unavoidable, German gunners were taught to aim for the turret, specifically trying to hit the gun mantlet or the turret ring, the vulnerable joint between turret and hull. A hit here could jam the turret or disable the gun without having to penetrate the armour fully. German tanks tried to engage from defilade hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed, minimising the target presented to the powerful 17-pounder. They avoided open ground where possible, sticking to urban areas and forests where engagement ranges were shorter and manoeuvrability mattered more than long-range gunnery. But these tactical adjustments could only do so much. The fundamental problem remained. The Firefly could penetrate German armour at ranges where German guns could penetrate the Firefly. The Allied numerical advantage meant that even with equal capability per tank, the Germans were being overwhelmed. And the capability wasn't equal. The Firefly's gun was in many ways superior to the German 88mm Schwer-36 on the Tiger, and roughly equal to the Kr-43 on the King Tiger. One aspect often overlooked is the logistical implications of the Firefly. Each tank required 77 rounds of 17-pounder ammunition, enormous shells that took up significant space, but only 23 of these rounds were stored in easily accessible positions within the turret and fighting compartment. The other 54 were stored in less accessible locations in the hull, requiring the tank to be stationary and the crew to unbutton and manually transfer shells. This meant that in sustained combat, a Firefly could run through its ready ammunition relatively quickly, and would need time to replenish from hull storage. British logistics had to ensure that 17-pounder ammunition was available wherever Fireflies were operating, a separate supply chain from the standard 75mm ammunition used by other Shermans. The specialised nature of the ammunition meant it couldn't be cross-supplied to other units, adding complexity to supply operations. The muzzle blast and flash of the 17-pounder created additional challenges. Crews reported that firing at night temporarily blinded them, even with their eyes closed due to the enormous flash. The blast created pressure waves that could be felt physically, described as being slapped in the chest. In dusty conditions, firing the gun created enormous clouds that obscured visibility and clearly marked the tank's position. Crews learned to fire and immediately move, never staying in one position after shooting. The distinctive sound of the 17-pounder was recognisable to both sides. British and Canadian, troops called it various names, but the Germans had a specific term. They called the Firefly sound Donnerschlag, thunderclap, a recognition of the distinctive concussive report of the gun. German infantry reportedly learned to identify the sound and would immediately seek cover when they heard it, knowing that a Firefly was in action nearby. As the war moved into Germany itself in early 1945, Fireflies continued to prove their worth. The flatter, more open terrain of northern Germany favoured long-range gunnery, exactly where the 17-pounder excelled. German tank forces were by this point shadows of their former strength, short on fuel, ammunition, and replacement crews. The qualitative advantage German armour had enjoyed in 1943 and early 1944 had evaporated. The few remaining Panthers and Tigers were being engaged and destroyed by Fireflies, at ranges where the German crews often couldn't even see their attackers through the haze and smoke of the battlefield. The psychological damage was complete. German tank crews who had once confidently engaged multiple Allied tanks now operated in constant fear. The sound of a 17-pounder firing meant death was nearby, and there was often nothing they could do about it. Production of Fireflies continued until early 1945, with between 20,800 and 2,200 total conversions completed before the program ended. This made the Firefly the most numerous vehicle mounting the 17-pounder gun, though the numbers were still far lower than military commanders wanted. Demand always exceeded supply. But 2,000 Fireflies distributed among British and Canadian armoured units each capable of destroying any German tank at combat ranges, represented a massive shift in the balance of armoured power. The Americans notably did not adopt the Firefly. Around 100 were built for potential US use, but American armoured doctrine and institutional pride resisted adopting a British design. The US Army preferred to develop its own solutions, eventually fielding the 76mm gun on upgunned Shermans and the 90mm gun on the M26 Pershing. These weapons were effective but arrived later and in smaller numbers than the Firefly. The lasting impact of the Firefly can be measured in multiple ways. Tactically, it gave British and Commonwealth forces the ability to engage German heavy armour on equal terms for the first time. Strategically, it ensured that German armoured counterattacks in France, Belgium and Germany could be defeated without requiring massive numerical superiority. Psychologically, it destroyed the myth of German armour invincibility and shifted the mental burden of combat from Allied crews, who no longer felt helpless against Tigers and Panthers, to German crews, who now faced being outgunned for the first time since 1941. The German High Command was forced to admit, in internal assessments late in the war, that Allied tank-killing capability had reached parity or superiority over German capabilities. This was a stunning reversal from the confident assessments of 1943. The technical achievement of fitting the 17-pounder into the Sherman turret shouldn't be understated. It required genuine engineering innovation, solving problems that the official Ministry of Supply engineers had declared impossible. The rotated breech, the redesigned recoil system, the armoured bustle for the radio, these were elegant solutions to seemingly insurmountable challenges. That the conversion could be done quickly enough to have Fireflies ready for D-Day, just months after the programme began in earnest, speaks to both the urgency of the situation and the capability of British industry under wartime conditions. That over 2,000 conversions were completed during the war, each tank stripped down, modified, reassembled and tested, represents a remarkable feat of production. For the crews who operated Fireflies, the experience was unique. They knew they were priority targets. They knew German crews would try to kill them first. They knew that the long barrel marking them as different also marked them for death. But they also knew they had the most powerful tank gun in the Allied arsenal. They could kill Panthers and Tigers from ranges the Germans thought safe. They could protect the other tanks in their troop, providing the heavy firepower needed to defeat German armour. This created a curious mix of fear and pride. Firefly crews were aware of their vulnerability but also fiercely proud of their capability. Many veterans described the Firefly as the best tank they ever served in, despite its limitations and dangers. The German perspective, captured in post-war interviews and memoirs, reveals the profound impact the Firefly had on panzer operations. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders with 150 kills, stated in his memoirs that the appearance of Allied tanks with guns capable of penetrating German armour from range fundamentally changed the nature of armoured combat in the West. The casual confidence German crews had felt, knowing their armour was superior and their guns had greater reach, evaporated. Every engagement became potentially deadly. German tank commanders could no longer assume they could destroy the first Allied tank they encountered and then deal with the rest. Any Sherman might be a Firefly, and attacking it could be fatal. Hans von Luck, a veteran panzer commander, noted that by late 1944, German tank crews were experiencing the same helpless feeling Allied crews had experienced in 1943, knowing they could be destroyed at any moment by a gun they couldn't match. The tables had completely turned. One interesting aspect rarely discussed is the crew composition of Firefly units. Many gunners, like Joe Ekins, were relatively inexperienced. This was partly because the Firefly was new, so no one had extensive experience with it, but also because the British training system was producing adequately trained gunners by 1944. The real skill came from the commanders, experienced NCOs and officers who knew how to position the tank, when to fire, when to move. A Firefly with an average gunner but an experienced commander was far more effective than a Firefly with an excellent gunner but poor tactical employment. The gun's accuracy and penetration was so superior that gunners didn't need to be perfect shots. If they could hit somewhere on the target at range, the 17-pounder would do the rest. This was a tremendous advantage, as it meant that even replacement crews could be effective relatively quickly. The ammunition development for the 17-pounder is also worth noting. The initial armour-piercing ballistic-capped rounds were excellent, but by late 1944, even better ammunition was being issued. The armour-piercing discarding sabot round, known as APDS, had a tungsten core in a lightweight carrier that broke away after leaving the barrel. This increased the velocity dramatically, reaching 200 meters per second compared to 950 for standard AP rounds. The penetration was extraordinary. At 1,000 yards, APDS could penetrate 256 millimeters of armour, enough to pierce the frontal armour of even the King Tiger. However, APDS had accuracy issues at longer ranges and was initially available only in limited quantities. By early 1945, supply had improved, and Firefly crews were able to load APDS for situations where maximum penetration was needed. The existence of APDS meant that by war's end there was literally no German tank that the Firefly couldn't penetrate from the front at combat ranges. The last German advantage, the King Tiger's massively thick frontal armour, had been negated. The Firefly's career didn't end with World War II. Many served in post-war British forces, and some were supplied to other nations. Israel acquired Fireflies in the late 1940s and used them extensively in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and in subsequent conflicts through the 1950s. The Firefly gave Israeli armour a significant qualitative advantage over the mixed Arab armour, consisting mainly of older British and French tanks. Israeli crews praised the Firefly's gun, noting that it remained competitive even a decade after the war ended. Some Fireflies remained in service with various militaries into the 1960s, a remarkable longevity for a design that was essentially a wartime expedient. The legacy of the Firefly extends beyond its combat record. It proved that innovative engineering could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. It showed that existing equipment could be radically upgraded rather than replaced, a lesson that influenced post-war tank development. It demonstrated that the nation with greater industrial capacity and the willingness to rapidly adapt and innovate could overcome initial technical disadvantages. The Germans had built better tanks in 1943, but the Allies built a solution to those tanks faster than Germany could respond. By the time German designers were developing responses to the Firefly, the war was already lost. The Firefly was one of many technological adaptations that contributed to Allied victory, but it was particularly significant because it directly addressed the one area where Germany had maintained superiority, tank-on-tank combat, June 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945. In those 11 months, approximately 2,000 Fireflies fought their way from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. They destroyed thousands of German tanks, tank destroyers and armoured vehicles. They killed the most famous tank ace of the war. They broke the psychological dominance of German armour. They gave British and Canadian tankers a weapon that could stand against anything the Panzerwaffe could field. When that long 17-pounder barrel first opened fire at Noyon-Bessin on June 9, 1944, and Panthers began exploding under a gun they didn't know existed, it marked the beginning of the end for German armoured superiority in the West. The Germans had laughed in 1943 when they first encountered the Sherman, deriding it as a death trap, a Ronson lighter that brewed up with one hit. They weren't laughing after they encountered the Firefly. German armour was helpless when the Firefly first opened fire, and that helplessness would continue until Germany's final surrender. The thunder of the 17-pounder had spoken, and the Panzerwaffe's dominance was over. The Sherman Firefly's success in combat raised an uncomfortable question that would echo through the post-war analysis conducted by both British and American military historians. If mounting the 17-pounder on a Sherman was so effective, why hadn't it been done sooner? The answer reveals a complex web of institutional resistance, doctrinal disagreements, and the simple inertia that often plagues military bureaucracies even in wartime. The resistance began at the highest levels. The Tank Decision Board at the Ministry of Supply had initially rejected the proposal not out of malice, but from a genuine belief that it was technically impossible. British tank design philosophy had always emphasised purpose-built vehicles. The idea of radically modifying an American tank to mount a British gun violated the established approach. When Major Brighty first proposed the concept, the official response was dismissive. The Sherman turret was too small. The recoil would be unmanageable. The Americans wouldn't approve modifications to their design. Each objection seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a wall of institutional reluctance that nearly prevented the Firefly from ever existing. The Americans were even more resistant. When British liaison officers approached their American counterparts about the possibility of mounting the 17-pounder on Shermans, the reception was decidedly cool. American ordnance officers had their own programs for upgrading the Sherman's firepower. They were developing the 76mm M1 gun, which would eventually be mounted on later Sherman variants. The 76mm was a good gun, significantly better than the 75mm, but it wasn't in the same class as the 17-pounder. At 1,000 meters, the American 76mm could penetrate approximately 109mm of armor using standard AP ammunition. The 17-pounder could penetrate 150mm, nearly 40% more. Against the sloped armor of Panthers and the thick armor of Tigers, this difference was critical, but American doctrine didn't emphasize tank versus tank combat the way British doctrine did. The American view, shaped by General Leslie McNair and the Army Ground Forces, was that tanks were primarily exploitation and infantry support vehicles. Tank destroyers, purpose-built vehicles with powerful guns but light armor, would handle enemy tanks. This doctrinal division meant that American planners didn't see the urgent need for tanks with heavy anti-tank guns. They believed their system of specialized vehicles would work. By the time combat experience in North Africa and Italy proved this doctrine flawed, institutional momentum was too strong to change quickly. The American 76mm program continued, and the Firefly remained a British solution to a problem the Americans were slow to fully acknowledge. There was also an element of national pride at play. American officers were sensitive about their equipment being seen as inadequate. The Sherman was an American design, built in American factories, and it formed the backbone of Allied armoured forces. The suggestion that it needed a British gun to be truly effective was not well received in some quarters. One American ordnance officer reportedly stated that if British tanks were so much better, perhaps the British should build their own tanks rather than requesting American ones. This attitude, while not universal, created friction that delayed cooperation. The approximately 100 Fireflies built for potential American use sat largely unused, a testament to institutional pride overriding tactical necessity. The British themselves were conflicted about the Firefly. While frontline commanders quickly recognised its value, staff officers at higher echelons worried about logistical complications. The specialised 17-pounder ammunition required separate supply chains. Maintenance crews needed additional training. The modified turrets had unique spare parts requirements. Some planners argued it would be more efficient to wait for purpose-built British tanks like the Cromwell or the troubled Challenger rather than pursuing the Firefly conversion program. These concerns weren't without merit. The Firefly did complicate logistics, but the urgency of the tactical situation overrode these objections. Better to have a logistically complicated tank that could kill Panthers than a logistically simple tank that couldn't. Production priorities also created challenges. Britain's tank production was already stretched thin. Factories were building Cromwells, Churchills and various specialised vehicles for the invasion. Pulling Shermans off the line for conversion reduced the number of standard tanks available. The Royal Ordnance factories conducting the conversions were also handling repairs, upgrades to other vehicles, and manufacture of countless other items. Finding the capacity to convert over 2,000 Shermans while maintaining other production was a significant challenge. That it was accomplished at all speaks to the determination of British industry and the recognition, once the decision was made, that the Firefly was essential. The question of how many Fireflies to produce and how to allocate them generated considerable debate. Some commanders wanted Fireflies in every tank troop, replacing the standard Shermans entirely. Others argued for concentrating them in specialised anti-tank troops. The compromise of one Firefly per 4 tank troop was based on practical considerations. Ammunition supply couldn't support more. The weak high explosive round of the 17-pounder meant that troops needed the 75mm Shermans for infantry support, and concentrating too many Fireflies would make supply and maintenance more difficult. The 1 per troop ratio proved reasonably effective, though frontline commanders consistently requested more. Training crews for the Firefly presented its own challenges. The gun's loading procedure was different from the 75mm. The massive recoil required gunners to reacquire targets after each shot, a skill that took practice. Commanders needed to learn how to employ the Firefly tactically, using it as an overwatch weapon rather than exposing it unnecessarily. But time was desperately short in early 1944. Crews arriving from training depots had never seen a Firefly. They were handed unfamiliar tanks, given brief instruction, and sent into combat. That they performed as well as they did is remarkable. Joe Ekins destroyed 3 Tigers with only 5 practice rounds of prior experience. This wasn't typical, but it illustrates that the Firefly's gun was so powerful that even minimally trained crews could be devastatingly effective. The German response to the Firefly evolved slowly, hampered by poor intelligence and institutional problems of their own. German reconnaissance units were supposed to identify new Allied equipment and report it up the chain of command. These reports should have reached intelligence analysts who would assess the threat and disseminate information to frontline units. This system, which had worked well earlier in the war, was breaking down by 1944. Allied air superiority limited German reconnaissance. Reports from frontline units were often dismissed by higher headquarters as exaggerations or misidentifications. The German intelligence apparatus was increasingly focused on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet summer offensive of 1944 was destroying entire army groups. New Allied equipment in France wasn't the priority. When reports of long-barreled Shermans with exceptional armour-piercing capability finally reached German tank schools and training centres, updating doctrine and training materials took time. New crews arriving at the front in late 1944 might have received warnings about Fireflies, but they lacked the combat experience to effectively counter them. Veteran crews who survived encounters with Fireflies passed along their knowledge informally. Kill the long-barreled Shermans first. Don't assume you're safe at long range. Keep moving after firing. But informal knowledge transfer is slower and less reliable than formal doctrine, and many German crews paid with their lives while learning lessons that should have been systematically taught. German counter-tactics, when they finally developed, showed some sophistication. Ambushes from hull-down positions minimized the Firefly's range advantage. Urban combat, where engagement ranges dropped to 200 meters or less, negated the 17-pounder's superior ballistics. Fighting at night or in heavy weather reduced visibility and made the Firefly's long barrel harder to identify. German tank commanders learned to watch for the enormous muzzle flash and report Firefly positions to supporting artillery. Some German units assigned dedicated marksmen with anti-tank rifles or Panzerfausts to target Firefly commanders when they exposed themselves from the turret. These tactics had some success, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. When a Firefly engaged German armour at medium to long range from a good position, the German tank usually lost. The impact of the Firefly on German tactics extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Panzer divisions had traditionally operated aggressively, using their superior guns and armour to dominate engagements. Panthers and Tigers would advance boldly, confident in their ability to destroy Allied tanks before taking serious damage. The Firefly forced a more cautious approach. German tank commanders had to constantly assess whether that Sherman in the distance was a standard 75mm variant or a Firefly. This uncertainty slowed decision-making and made German armour more reactive than proactive. Aggressive advances became riskier. The psychological burden shifted from Allied crews, who had spent 1942 and 1943 feeling outgunned, to German crews who now felt hunted by an enemy they couldn't always identify until it was too late. This psychological shift cannot be overstated. Tank combat is as much about confidence as capability. A crew that believes their tank is superior, that they can penetrate enemy armour while shrugging off return fire, fights more aggressively and effectively. A crew that fears every engagement might be their last becomes hesitant, cautious, prone to mistakes. From 1941 through 1943, German tank crews had enjoyed that confidence, while Allied crews struggled with its absence. The Firefly reversed this dynamic. British and Canadian Firefly crews knew they could kill anything they faced. German crews knew they could be killed by anything they faced because any Sherman might be a Firefly. The Firefly also changed how Allied armour was employed tactically. Before the Firefly, British tank doctrine emphasised mass. Overwhelm German positions with numbers, accept losses, exploit breakthroughs with infantry. This was necessary because individual British tanks couldn't reliably defeat German heavy armour. But the Firefly allowed more sophisticated tactics. Mixed tank troops could now engage German armour at range while standard Shermans manoeuvred for flanking shots or supported infantry. The Firefly provided overwatch, eliminating German tanks before they could threaten the advance. This combined arms approach at the troop level made British and Canadian armour far more flexible and effective. Allied artillery coordination with Fireflies also improved as the campaign progressed. Forward observers would spot German armour and direct Firefly troops to intercept. When German tanks were caught in the open by artillery fire, they would typically button up, reducing visibility, and seek cover. This made them vulnerable to Fireflies positioned in ambush along likely retreat routes. British artillery and armour coordination, which had been mediocre in North Africa and Italy, reached a high level of effectiveness in Northwest Europe, with the Firefly serving as the killing blow in many coordinated engagements. The maintenance burden of the Firefly, while significant, was manageable due to the Sherman's generally reliable mechanical design. The M4 Sherman, for all its combat shortcomings, was mechanically robust. The Chrysler A57 multibank engine in the M4A4, the most common Firefly variant, was unusual but proven reliable. The vertical volute spring suspension was simple and easy to maintain. The tracks were readily available. The modifications to mount the 17-pounder didn't significantly impact this mechanical reliability. The gun itself required careful maintenance, particularly the recoil mechanism, but Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers attached to armoured regiments were trained to handle this. Fireflies that threw a track or suffered engine failure could usually be repaired in the field using standard Sherman parts. This was a crucial advantage. Exotic tanks like the Panther, with its complex transmission and final drives, often broke down and couldn't be quickly repaired. The Firefly combined devastating firepower with mechanical dependability. Ammunition expenditure rates for Fireflies were surprisingly moderate. Despite carrying fewer ready rounds than standard Shermans, Firefly crews rarely expended all their ammunition in combat. The 17-pounder's effectiveness meant that most engagements were over quickly, with German tanks destroyed in the opening shots. A Firefly might fire 5 to 10 rounds in a typical engagement, well within the ready ammunition capacity. The real limitation was sustained combat over multiple engagements without resupply. A troop operating deep during an advance might fight 3 or 4 separate actions in a day, and by the 4th engagement the Firefly might be running low. But British logistics generally kept ammunition flowing, and Fireflies running completely dry was relatively rare. The Firefly's weak high-explosive ammunition remained a persistent limitation throughout the war. The shell walls had to be thick to withstand the powerful propellant charge, leaving less room for explosive filler. When Firefly crews engaged infantry or soft targets, the results were unimpressive compared to the 75mm. This is why the mixed troop composition worked well. When a German machine gun nest needed to be eliminated, the 75mm Shermans handled it. When a Panther appeared, the Firefly handled it. Each tank type complemented the other's weaknesses. Some Firefly crews carried a few high-explosive rounds, but most loaded primarily armour-piercing ammunition, accepting that they weren't optimised for infantry support. The introduction of APDS ammunition in late 1944 created new tactical possibilities, but also new problems. The discarding Sabot rounds had exceptional penetration, but were less accurate at long range due to the instability of the sub-caliber projectile after the sabots separated. At ranges under 1,000 metres, APDS was devastatingly effective. Beyond 1 to 500 metres, it was unreliable. Gunners had to judge range and decide which ammunition type to use. Standard AP rounds for long-range shots, APDS for closer engagements against heavily armoured targets. This added complexity to the gunner's job, but experienced crews learned to manage it. The psychological impact on German crews of knowing that Allied tanks had ammunition that could penetrate King Tiger frontal armour cannot be measured, but was certainly significant. Supply of APDS was irregular in late 1944, creating frustration among Firefly crews. Some regiments received generous allocations, others received almost none. The tungsten cores required for APDS were in limited supply, with competing demands from artillery, anti-tank guns, and multiple nations' armed forces. British planners prioritised APDS for specific operations where heavy German armour was expected. During Operation Market Garden, Fireflies in the Guards Armoured Division received extra APDS allocations because intelligence predicted they would face heavy armour around Arnhem. During less critical operations, APDS might not be available at all. This inconsistency forced crews to plan engagements assuming they would only have standard AP ammunition available, treating APDS as a bonus rather than a standard load. The German King Tiger, officially the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf B, represented Germany's final attempt to maintain armour superiority through sheer thickness. Weighing nearly 70 tons and protected by up to 180 mm of frontal armour, the King Tiger was nearly impervious to most Allied guns. But not the Firefly with APDS. At 500 metres, an APDS, round from a 17-pounder, could penetrate the King Tiger's frontal plate. This was perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of the Firefly's capability. Germany's heaviest production tank, a vehicle that required bridges to be reinforced before crossing and consume fuel at an alarming rate, could be destroyed frontally by a modified Sherman. The symbolic significance was profound. Germany's best couldn't match a British improvisation mounted on an American tank. Encounters between Fireflies and King Tigers were relatively rare, as Germany produced only about 485 King Tigers and many served on the Eastern Front. But when these engagements occurred, they demonstrated the Firefly's capability. In March 1945, during the Rhine crossing operations, Fireflies from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment engaged King Tigers from Heavy SS Panzer Battalion 506. The German tanks were positioned in fortified positions along the Rhine, using their long 88mm KWK 43 L71 guns to interdict crossing points. British artillery suppressed the positions while Fireflies manoeuvred to flanking positions. At ranges of 600 to 800 metres, the Fireflies engaged with APDS. 3 King Tigers were destroyed, their turrets penetrated or tracks disabled. The Germans withdrew the remaining King Tigers rather than risk their complete loss. The most powerful tank Germany produced had been forced to retreat from modified Shermans. The Firefly's role in the final months of the war shifted somewhat as German armour became scarce. By February and March 1945, German tank units were shadows of their former strength. Fuel shortages limited operations. Replacement vehicles and crews were unavailable. Many German tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture rather than lost in combat. The Firefly increasingly found itself engaging fortified positions, bunkers, and dug-in anti-tank guns rather than mobile armour. The 17-pounder's penetration made it effective against concrete fortifications, punching through walls that standard tank guns couldn't touch. Firefly crews adapted to this new role, using their powerful gun to support infantry assaults on German defensive lines. The battle for Germany's industrial regions saw Fireflies in urban combat, a challenging environment for any tank. Cities like Kleve, Wessel, and eventually into the Ruhr pocket, British armour had to fight building to building. The Firefly's long barrel was a disadvantage in tight urban streets, limiting traverse and making the tank unwieldy, but the gun's penetration could defeat any barrier. Fireflies would position at street intersections, covering multiple approaches, ready to engage any German armour that appeared. German tank destroyers like the Jagd Panther with excellent guns and low profiles were dangerous opponents in cities. But even these had to respect the Firefly's 17-pounder. Several engagements in urban settings saw Fireflies destroying Jagd Panthers in point-blank gun duels, the superior British, rate of fire making the difference when penetration was equal. The crew experience in the final months of the war was markedly different from the desperate fighting in Normandy. By early 1945, British and Canadian tank crews had extensive combat experience. The confused, chaotic battles of the Bocage had taught hard lessons. Firefly crews were now veterans, understanding exactly how to employ their weapon. New replacement crews joining Firefly troops learned from experienced commanders and gunners. The terrifying uncertainty of June 1944, when crews were facing Panthers and Tigers with minimal training, was gone. Firefly troops operated with confidence, knowing their capability and trusting their equipment. This psychological shift was as important as any tactical or technical advantage. German prisoners captured in early 1945 provided valuable intelligence about enemy perceptions of the Firefly. Interrogations revealed that German tank crews feared the Firefly more than any other Allied tank. Several prisoners stated they would rather face 2 standard Shermans than 1 Firefly. The long barrel was instantly recognizable, and German gunners knew they had to kill it immediately or risk their own destruction. But by 1945, many German crews were too inexperienced to effectively implement this priority targeting. Rushed through abbreviated training and thrown into combat, they lacked the skills to quickly identify and engage priority targets before being destroyed themselves. The Firefly's contribution to Allied victory in northwest Europe is difficult to quantify precisely, but was undoubtedly significant. By the most conservative estimates, Fireflies destroyed at least 1,000 German tanks and tank destroyers during the 11 months from D-Day to VE Day. Some estimates place the figure much higher, potentially over 2,000 kills. These numbers represent a substantial portion of German armour losses in the theatre. More importantly, the Firefly's presence forced German armour to operate less effectively. The psychological pressure, the need for caution, the uncertainty about whether any given Sherman was a Firefly, all degraded German operational effectiveness in ways that don't appear in kill statistics, but were nonetheless crucial. Post-war analysis by both British and American military historians reached similar conclusions. The Firefly was one of the most cost-effective weapons modifications of the war. For the relatively modest investment of converting existing Shermans and producing specialised ammunition, the British gained a tank that could defeat any German armour. The conversion cost per tank was approximately $1,000, far less than producing a new tank design. The time from program approval to first production, Fireflies was measured in months, not the years that new tank designs required. In terms of combat effectiveness per pound sterling invested, the Firefly was arguably the best return on investment of any British armoured vehicle programme in World War II. The American refusal to adopt the Firefly remained a source of friction in post-war military relations. British officers who had commanded Fireflies in combat were openly critical of American decisions that left US tank crews with inferior guns. American tankers who fought in Germany in 1945 with 76mm Shermans, while British units alongside them had Fireflies knew they were outgunned. Several American tank commanders requested transfers to British units so they could operate Fireflies. The official American position remained that their own upgrading programs were adequate, but combat results told a different story. American tank losses in northwest Europe were proportionally higher than British and Canadian losses, partly attributable to the lack of a gun equivalent to the 17-pounder. The institutional resistance that nearly prevented the Firefly from being built became a case study in military procurement and the dangers of bureaucratic inertia. Post-war military education included the Firefly program as an example of how informal innovation by mid-ranking officers can solve problems that formal institutional structures miss. Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, neither holding positions of great authority, pushed the Firefly concept against official resistance. Their persistence, combined with the willingness of a few key officials like Claude Gibb to listen, made the Firefly possible. Modern military organisations point to this example when discussing the importance of listening to field officers and being willing to challenge institutional assumptions. The technical innovations pioneered for the Firefly influenced post-war tank design. The concept of the rotated breech became standard in several later tank guns where space was limited. The use of twin recoil cylinders positioned laterally rather than longitudinally was adopted in various armoured vehicle designs. The armoured radio bustle, initially an improvisation to make room for the gun, became a common feature on many post-war tanks. Engineers studying the Firefly solutions recognised that necessity had driven genuine innovation, and these innovations had broader applications. The Firefly's success also influenced post-war doctrine about specialisation versus versatility in tank design. The debate between multi-role tanks that can perform various missions adequately versus specialised tanks optimised for specific roles continued throughout the Cold War. The Firefly represented the specialised approach, a tank killer that sacrificed infantry support capability for anti-armour performance. This worked in World War II because standard Shermans provided the infantry support while Fireflies handled enemy armour. Modern armies struggled with whether to maintain this mixed force structure or adopt universal designs. The trend eventually favoured versatility, with modern main battle tanks mounting guns effective against both armour and infantry targets, but the Firefly demonstrated that specialisation could be highly effective when properly integrated into combined arms tactics. Israel's continued use of Fireflies through the 1950s provided additional combat data. In the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israeli Fireflies engaged Egyptian armour, destroying numerous Soviet-supplied T-34 or 85 tanks. The 17-pounder, while now over a decade old, remained effective against these medium tanks. Israeli crews reported that the Firefly's gun could penetrate T-34 armour from any angle at combat ranges. The mechanical reliability of the Sherman chassis, maintainable with available parts and expertise, made the Firefly attractive to the resource-constrained Israeli military. Only with the introduction of more modern tanks in the late 1950s and early 1960s did Israel finally retire its Fireflies, ending a remarkable 15-year combat career for a weapon originally designed as a wartime expedient. The handful of surviving Fireflies became treasured museum pieces and are now among the most valuable World War II armoured vehicles to collectors. Only about 10 complete authentic Fireflies exist worldwide. Most are in British museums, including the Tank Museum at Bovington, which houses several examples. The rarity stems from post-war scrapping. Most Fireflies were either destroyed in combat, worn out through use, or cut up for scrap metal in the late 1940s when Britain desperately needed raw materials. The few that survived did so by chance, overlooked in storage depots, or acquired by private collectors before their historical significance was fully appreciated. The veterans who served in Firefly crews remained proud of their service for the rest of their lives. Reunions of Firefly regiments continued for decades after the war. Joe Ekins, the gunner who almost certainly killed Michael Whitman, never sought publicity and rarely discussed his wartime service. He worked as a labourer after the war, living quietly in Northamptonshire until his death in 2012 at age 88. He gave few interviews, uncomfortable with being called a hero, insisting he was just doing his job. Other Firefly veterans felt similarly. They had operated a powerful weapon in terrible circumstances and survived. That was enough. The fame, such as it was, seemed unnecessary to men who had seen friends die and knew their own survival was as much luck as skill. The historiography of the Firefly evolved considerably over the decades. Early post-war accounts barely mentioned it, focusing on better-known tanks like the Tiger and Sherman. British official histories acknowledged the Firefly's role, but didn't emphasise it particularly. Only as military historians gained access to unit war diaries, combat reports, and veteran testimonies in the 1970s and 1980s did the Firefly's significance become clear. Books analysing the Normandy campaign began highlighting how Fireflies had systematically destroyed German armour thought invulnerable. The controversy over who killed Wittmann brought attention to the Firefly's capabilities, even as it overshadowed the weapon's broader impact across hundreds of engagements. Modern analysis using operational research methods has attempted to quantify the Firefly's impact more precisely. Studies comparing British and Canadian armoured unit performance with and without Fireflies show measurably better tank versus tank exchange ratios for units with standard Firefly allocations. Units forced to operate with fewer Fireflies than the standard allocation suffered higher losses and achieved fewer kills. Units that received additional Fireflies above the standard allocation performed even better. The correlation between Firefly allocation and combat effectiveness is statistically significant, confirming what veterans always knew: the Firefly made a crucial difference. The alternative history question of what would have happened without the Firefly is worth considering. If Major Brighty's proposal had been definitively rejected, if the institutional resistance had prevailed, British and Canadian forces would have entered Normandy with Shermans armed only with 75mm guns. The Challenger tank might have eventually entered service, but it was plagued with problems and was produced in limited numbers. British tank crews would have faced Panthers and Tigers, with guns inadequate to penetrate frontal armour. The tactical result would have been similar to early Eastern Front engagements, where Soviet tankers had to accept heavy losses to achieve kills through flanking manoeuvres. British losses would have been significantly higher. German armour would have maintained its psychological dominance longer. The breakout from Normandy might have been delayed. Victory would still have come, through weight of numbers and Allied air superiority, but the cost would have been measured in additional thousands of casualties.